Hello, my name is Mark Emerson. I'm one of the National Behaviour Advisors, and this video is intended to give you some practical suggestions and policies and procedures and systems which will help with the behaviour improvement in your school. It's certainly been something through research and through our experience has been particularly helpful in schools across the country, and it's our intention that we can share that with you. If we just start with the beginning of this slide deck, the training that usually takes 2 hours 30 minutes, and if you want to use this slide deck for that and this video for that, then there are places where we will stop for reflection within the video, which actually might be worthwhile building into your program, so you've got 20 or 30 minutes to have a really a good think about the questions being asked. Pre-reading, which is recommended for this this virtual unit, is Creating a Culture by Tom Bennett, on which a lot of the research findings are based. Teach Like a Champion, Doug Lemov. It's a pretty seminal book in terms of classroom practice. Also, potential interest. There are some more recent articles by To Change Your Company's Culture, Don't Start by Trying to Change the Culture by Michael Beer. Avoiding Social Risk in Adolescence by Sarah Jane Blakemore, and Peer Contagion in the Interventions of Children and Adolescents by Tom Dishian, 2011. These all point to the need to develop a culture where the potential peer group influence of children and the influence of the school on children in your context is positive and leads to positive behavioral outcomes rather than negative behavioral outcomes. There is a centrality in this process of developing consistent routines and rituals. And as Tom says in his research, staff and students need to know what the culture looks like in practice. And we need to design routines that all staff and all students should follow. And then behavior which is performed most or all of the time should be made into a routine. So that might be entries to classrooms, that might be lunchtime arrangements, break time arrangements, but certainly we need to look at every aspect of the school and think, how can we manage this better? So this module builds on previous modules or other modules in our program, but it talks a lot to how routines and rituals build behavioral norms and generate cultural shifts, and how we can design routines and rituals as school leaders, and how school leaders within these sorts of contexts are able to think about all aspects of the life of the school and create rules and approaches, routines and rituals, which are simple and certain in the way they're deployed, which codify the practice and give a very certain language for behavior, and gives you an opportunity to explore unintended consequences. And then how these routines are communicated through very clear documentation and aligned documentation. And then we're going to look at some of the common difficulties and how these can be overcome, as well as thinking about some of the challenges to establish long-term success, because largely the consistency we're looking for is not just at a moment in time or at a period in time, it's actually over the long term. So how do we design systems which are going to be sustainable in the longer term, which is critical for the development of a culture in a school which is positive. So we're going to talk about the importance of routines. We're going to talk about the elements of school life that probably should be ritualized. We're going to look at some examples of how schools approach this and some of the difficulties in maintaining standards and how leaders have successfully overcome them, largely through their leadership beyond the written documentation, which is actually one of the core aspects of developing anything within a school. Any change, any development requires us to think about how we're going to lead through not just the short term, not just the introduction, but the longer term. How do we sustain things? So where do we start? Well, great schools don't leave good behavior to chance. We know that. They explicitly teach good behavior through routines and rituals they expect. They will induct children, they will induct staff into what's expected, and they will hold staff and children to the expectations that they have. This is positive behavioral norms, but not just the simple prohibition of unacceptable behavior. So, in many schools, there will be things about how children are greeted and how they're expected to respond to that greeting, which is really trying to build in positivity and warmth within the rituals and routines of the school. So the expectations apply to staff as well as pupils, and mostly, in my experience and all the experience of the school leaders we've worked with, the efficacy, the fidelity, and the long-term development of these sustainable approaches have depended on staff, depends on the adults, and we need to concentrate on adult behavior in order to change children's behavior. And that's not just adult behavior in the interactions, the social interactions, but the adult behavior in the adherence to the expectations of the school as people have agreed to. So how do routines and rituals build behavioral norms? The article I referred to at the beginning by Michael Beard, the Harvard Business School, to change your company's culture, don't start by trying to change the culture, is quite an interesting article. It's not long, but what he says is that we often spend a lot of time talking about vision statements, a lot of time expounding what we want to see, and we don't pay enough attention to the day-to-day. And the day-to-day fidelity is what changes the culture. So he says, don't sit around with post-it notes and try to work out what the vision statement needs to change. It probably is reasonable. Let's just start looking at the systems and the structures within the school or within any organization which develop a culture. Because we can write things in a book, we can write things in a policy, but they're not the day-to-day. If they're not the day-to-day experience of the school, then that doesn't change the culture. So the design, alignment, fidelity, and effective implementation for systems of behavior management are no different. They generate more positive behaviors in the school. And if we can maintain those positive behaviors, that's when you get the cultural shift. That's when you get the more positive learning environment. And it's not easy. I know it's not easy. I walk the corridors nearly every day and, challenge children, challenge staff to do the things that we want to see them doing. Obviously, in a warm and encouraging way, but ultimately with a strong bottom line. The design and implementation obviously needs to be very, very clear and needs to be codified so everybody knows what they need to do and knows what the expectations that have been agreed by the leadership team and the wider school and the governors are, and therefore are able much more easily to address those and achieve those. So when we get down to the design, simplicity is very important because schools are very difficult places. And I grew up through my school career in times when there were huge policies which were simply not deliverable. I'm sure people felt very good and very virtuous in developing them, but actually they weren't actionable. So we need things to be simple. We also need them to be ritualized and routine. So this is just what we do in our school. This is just how we operate. We always say hello to students in this school, and we all expect them to say a good morning, sir, back, or good morning, miss, back. That's certainly what we expect. And certainly, in addition to that, if a child behaves in this way, this is how they're rewarded. And if a child behaves in this way, these are the negative consequences they will experience. And this is just really good child development, setting down boundaries, placing rewards in front of them, being the corporate parent that we are, through the responsibility of in loco parentis. So one of the big questions is about this. If we are setting up systems and routines across schools, where do we give discretion? We often have a lot of pressure for things to be adjusted for individual children, whether that's relation to special education needs or disabilities, or sometimes because a child has a particularly difficult circumstance. And one of the difficulties in our schools, we've got increasing numbers of these children coming through or presenting in this way. So how do we balance the need for consistency, simple application of rules and certainty over what happens, with the need to make reasonable adjustments? And it's not an easy question to answer. So in the next 5-10 minutes, however much you want to allocate to it, it's probably something for you to self-reflect on, or potentially, if you're in a group of people at the moment, to actually think about these questions. To what extent should behaviour policy be flexible or adjusted for individual pupils? Under what circumstances do you think it's acceptable, and by the same token, unacceptable to accept adjustments? And how can we scaffold behavioural system for special needs children within a safe and calm school behavioural environment? So I'll leave that to you to pause for a little bit, and then I will return to the discussion. From our experience across many schools, the hundreds of schools we've worked with, it is really critical that for the majority of pupils, there are very clear systemized processes. For children that we have concerns about, particularly with special needs children, we need to find ways of managing what are predictable behaviours, and to put in place processes to make sure that they can adhere to, as far as possible, the expectations of the school. And I could just give one quick example. If a child has Tourette's and is expected to line up quietly before they come into a lesson, either in a corridor on the playground, which often happens for primary schools outside a classroom, or in a secondary school, which might be, a whole year group lineup, then it's obviously not sensible for us to put that child in a position where there will be a predictable problem and a predictable negative consequence, or a consequence which isn't enforced with the other children see. So we have to find ways around that, potentially by working one-to-one with that child, or finding that child a way of entering the classroom in a different way, or maybe being managed by an adult until they can be brought into the classroom at a different point in time. So that's just one example. I'm sure you could think of many others. But the really critical thing is these adaptations should be exceptional, and we should be expecting as many children as possible to adhere to what we consider to be the school standards, the non-negotiable standards of a school. And you constructing that as school leaders is very, very important. And how we go about doing that, and how you go about doing that, will be critical to success. And it needs to be thought about before in advance of actually doing it. So one of the other things we need to think about is what sort of language we use. One of the things we've seen is that in schools which have used quite abstract language, there's some schools, they talk about a consequence list, a C1, a C2, a C3. That has been much less effective than using words which have intrinsic meaning. So, for example, in a number of primary schools, you have a warning, then a consequence. Now, warning means something clearly, and consequence means something. And that enables the child, or gives a child an opportunity to self-regulate. If they're giving a warning which isn't attached to a consequence, then they have an opportunity to adjust their behavior, and then the consequence follows. But they also understand, they should be told what that warning is for. And there should be a very clear understanding of what's acceptable and not acceptable, and that should be in a child-friendly language, so they're aware of that. So we found the systems which rely on obscure letters or colours are less effective than systems that rely on words which carry intrinsic meaning. So a merit system, a class dojo or reward system equally needs to have something with intrinsic meaning. The way in which this languages deployed is very important as well. So if you're in a school, and I see this all the time, even in schools which espouse a common language, you will hear staff talking to children, engaging in discussion about why they shouldn't do things, rather than punctuating that discussion with this is a reminder. So, for example, it may well be that a child is not paying attention, looking out the window, and there's a bee in the classroom, whatever. Then we would expect the school to have some sort of scripting, which would allow teachers to say, right, Joey or Basil or whatever the name of the child is, that is a reminder because I need your full attention. And if they continue to not adhere to your expectation, then Basil, here is your warning because I've already reminded you. And that's prior to any detention or consequence. And that gives the whole class, the whole group of children, as well as that child, an understanding that these are escalation points in a behavioral system. Some other schools use words like correction, but it's always important within that to say what the correction is for. Use the word and say what the correction is for. These systems, we find them far more effective. And if you don't have an intrinsic meaning for your behavioral system, I would advise you to think very carefully about it or seriously about bringing one in for those reasons, because it does provide very clear instructions to children about how they should be behaving. We also need to think about when we're looking at all of our systems and rituals and routines, what might be the unintended consequences. Sometimes, by very definition, they are difficult to identify in terms of workload, because often as senior leaders will say, well, if you just did this and you just did that, and before we know it, we've got an aggregation of marginal activities, which actually means that it's very difficult to do the whole thing that we're expecting staff to do. So it's very important that we share any proposal as widely as possible to look at the different perspectives. One-way systems are a classic. You know, how do we reduce overcrowding in a corridor? You introduce a one-way system. Most people do that and find that they've created a log jam somewhere else, or they've created another problem with children using it as an excuse not to get to lesson on time, whatever the problem is. But the reality of all things that we introduce in good faith is that there will be a consequence. And so we need to think about that, because every school operates in a different context. You can't just pick up a policy or an approach from another school and think that it's just going to fit your school perfectly. And in a school, we've got 6 secondary schools, 3 primary schools, and we have basically the same expectations across all the schools. We have the same use of language. We don't have one-way systems in all schools. We have in some. We don't have silent corridors in all schools. We have in a few. But we all expect quiet movement from one place to another. And that's largely to do with the shape of the building. So there are very practical logistical considerations we need to think about. The size of your dining hall might impact on how many children you can feed at one time. So that might lead to a different way of operating at lunchtime. So it's very important that whatever you look at in terms of examples that I've got, or you get from other schools, or you pick up from the internet, that you actually don't just adopt them, but you think about their applicability to your school and the types of problems you might face, and then you share it, because inevitably, when you look at these things, you think you've got a solution, and you don't always, as a small group, as an SLT, understand potentially what might be a problem for the early years staff, or the office staff, or the geography department at the end of the corridor. So where do we start? What are the core documents we need to get right and we need to align? The first one is the staff code. We need to make sure that the staff code it impresses upon staff the need to be consistent, the need to follow the agreed protocols, because that benefits everybody, and most of all, it benefits the children. There's a little phrase we sometimes use: they're doing the best thing for you and your subjects is not necessarily the best thing for the child and for their family. And I often talk about this in relation to, assessment systems. We really do need to think about what is the best for the child. And we do know all child development hinges to a large scale on really high level expectation and consistency in delivering that. And that really comes back to number one, the staff code and how staff operate, the certainty of adult behavior. Obviously, you need to put the behavioural expectations down. That's essentially the rules, and they operate in different ways in different schools in different phases. In primary, will be different to secondary and early years. It'll be different to Key Stage 2. It'll be different to Key Stage 3. It'll be different to sixth form. But what are the expectations? And what are the pathways? What are the escalation points, both for rewards and also for negative consequences? What are your lesson routines? How do children enter classrooms? What are they going to do when they come into that classroom? Which is a guide for staff as well as children. But what is the consistency of approach that we expect within our classroom routines? And how do we communicate all of this to stakeholders? And I'm thinking mostly about parents and children, but also governors and the wider community. So a little pause for reflection again. Looking at your current behavioural systems and those sort of 5 documents, how far do you think they embody the principles of simplicity? How far are they codified and habitually used, have codified and habitually used language with intrinsic meaning? Are you still using the consequences C1, C2, 3, C4? Do you have anything and teachers just making it up? Or are you using a lot of shushes to get children quiet? And how are you addressing any negative and unintended consequences? Or what are you doing to try and address some of the difficulties without creating undue concerns further down the line? So a little bit of time to think about that, and then we'll return to the presentation. Usually when we've conducted the training sessions, people have been very open and candid about the fact that their systems aren't simple enough. There are problems around the consistency, particularly the consistency of adult implementation. And they have not always been using codified language, which actually has some intrinsic meaning for the children, for parents, and for the staff. And the movements towards those 3 things have had a big impact on changing the behaviour within the school in the longer term. So let's look at the staff code. There's nothing as important as school leadership to actually being able to ensure that staff operate and adhere to agreed norms. So, that's a lot of low stakes over communication. The staff are critical, and the certainty of adult behaviour is really important. And the written document, which clearly states how staff should support school policy and the logic behind it, needs to be there, but also the consequences for not doing so. So in the staff code, there should be some understanding that we expect everybody to do this. We expect them to operate like this. And if that isn't the case, you will be spoken to about that, not in a potentially negative or disciplinary way, but actually, this is what we expect in the school, and we will give you feedback if that's not happening, because the low stakes, consistent feedback is really important. And the amount of times that, and I have to say in my own career, I've not been good at this all the time. And, I've thought, oh, I have to talk to that teacher again about being at the door to receive the children at the end of break. And it's the 15th time I'm speaking to them about it. So in my head, I'm thinking, oh, this is nagging. this is a difficult conversation, and maybe I'll park it until tomorrow. And actually, what I've learned over the years, I'm quite old now, so learned over the years that actually it's much better to broach that subject every time you see it, every single time you see it. And then if necessary, to escalate to a formal process, which might start off with a management advice email, but ultimately might end up in low-level disciplinary meetings, because it's not a capability issue being able to, well, not usually anyway, being able to get to your door and greet the children as they come in. I'm sure that most of our able-bodied staff can do that. So that would be an expectation. So if somebody's not doing it and they've been told many, many times about it, at what stage do you start thinking, well, this is now a disciplinary issue? And I think I've shied away from that in certain circumstances, not now so much. And that's why I'm getting greater fidelity to the expectations of the school. And other staff, as you know, will look at that and think, okay, there is a line there. We understand where it is. So it should be, this adherence should be, I sort of call it continuous collective feedback. Everybody in a great school, everybody reminds everybody else all the time when things are not being done well. And this is critical for behavior, probably, over any other policy in the school, because behavioral policies and behavioral approaches have to be conducted by the receptionist, the support staff, the special needs support, the classroom teachers, the senior leaders. Everybody should be involved in that continuous collective feedback to make sure that standards are held high. So an example of staff code opening statement, this is one you can read for yourself, but it's really saying that, it's really laying out that expectation that high standards of conduct are really important if we're expecting pupils to do the same. So let's move on to what the behavioural expectations are. Every school should have a behaviour policy. I mean, it's law now. You have to have a behavioural policy, and it needs to be shared with parents, and it needs to be updated annually. And that will obviously have an overall vision, and the expectations should be articulated. But very few schools do that with enough clarity. There are often grey areas which actually mean that children who, for example, are not paying attention can argue, well, I was just looking out the window. It's no big deal. Well, if we believe that every minute in school in learning counts, it is a pretty big deal. Maybe not to start with, but it does become a big deal if it's continually happening. They should also cover other specific expectations, such as mobile phones, uniform, and we've got the new ruling on mobile phones. I actually have never had mobile phones in school since 2000 because they were just used for they create lots of difficulty. They're great devices for doing, Sparks maths on in the evening. Outside of school, great ways of communicating. Great ways of communicating with parents, but in school they're not necessary. And it's great to see them being, the recommendation, the expectation that they're not in schools at all. But other expectations, uniform, common legal transgressions, they should all be included in there. We shouldn't leave anything to chance. But we've also got to make sure that when we do that, we curate it into a manageable document. And it should be simply communicated to parents and staff through, ideally through some sort of parent-school agreement and a parental handbook. So I've got some examples to follow. There are some critical differences in different contexts. There are critical differences between APs and PRUs and special schools and mainstream secondaries, mainstream primaries. Within primaries, there's a big difference between the behavioural expectations of early years children and Key Stage 2 children on their transfer to secondary. So we do know that things need to be adapted for different schools. So I've got a couple of standard documents to show you snippets of and examples that I just want to point to certain aspects to exemplify what sorts of things need to be in there. And of course, these are now published on everybody's website. So if you want to look at, if you know of a school in your area which has got great behaviour, or certainly got a reputation of great behaviour, they will have all this documentation that you can look at and help influence what you do as you move forward. So this is from a secondary school, and it identifies 10 rules, 10 classroom rules, and then 10 general rules. And I wanted to point out the rule, the general rule 8, because this is where this particular school has, and I'm not sure you can see it, I can't see it there, so I'll just move this. It says refrain from congregating outside the school gates at the end of the day. Now, this is a particular issue in this particular school, and it also relates to travel to and from the school, which is number 3 on the general rules as well. And the reason for this is because there are a lot of secondary schools in the area. It's a built-up area of London, and there was lots of trouble outside school at the end of the day. At the very least, it was annoying to the general public and the local community, but at its worst, it led to big fights. And so the rule was that they had to leave the school within 30 minutes. And actually, there was a consequence. If they were seen in school uniform 30 minutes after school around the area, there would be a detention the next day. And that was to try and to ensure that there was an insistence that children went home, they changed, they checked in with their parents, or they checked in at home before they did anything else in the evening. And that was really important for that school in that particular context. It may not be that your schools would be in that position, but it's an example of why a rule which pertains to a particular school in a particular circumstance, which is now being woven in to their policy and would not be necessarily standard. So to support the behavioural expectations, there should also be a behaviour pathways document, and that one will promote the rules and rituals and also pins them down to rewards and sanctions. If we look at this example again, this is an example of rewards in a secondary school. There's a lot of research on rewards, and actually the best reward you can give children, the easiest reward to give children is positive feedback, positive verbal feedback. And I'm not sure we do enough of that in our schools. And certainly it's something that doesn't create any workload, but is really well received by children. And looking at EAF data and research, seems to be the most effective in terms of motivation. Having said that, intrinsic rewards, extrinsic rewards, sorry, are potentially very useful as well. So there's in this schedule, what's interesting at the bottom is there's some tangible rewards at the bottom, which are amounts of money which would go to a tutor group for a trip if they've done particularly well. And reward trips, particularly in secondary school, seem to be, in this secondary school anyway, a thing they want to concentrate on. In a primary school, this is a real, again, the allocation of rewards, really emphasizing the use of praise and to enhance children's behavior. But it also puts the comment in there, which is actually really important, that overusing praise can mean that children don't respond effectively, or praising children for doing things they should do anyway has to be very carefully couched. Giving people merits for not wrecking a classroom is not necessarily going to encourage everybody else to do well. So we need to think very carefully about that and make sure that there are very consistent messaging about how these rewards are distributed or disseminated. and we need to make sure that the individual children receive the correct level of praise for their thoughts, actions, and learning. And that's made, particularly in this extract, it's made very clear at the top there. This is an example of a consequences document for secondary, and it just shows the types of things that would happen using a reminder, warning, detention model. Just looking at yellow, recorded on an event log, lack of attention in class or talking in the line would be a reminder, then a warning, then a detention, and the parental support, we'll be asking them to discuss it with the child. But obviously it goes right down to some pretty difficult stuff like bringing in illegal things or being violent, and those sorts of things would normally lead to a suspension. This is a behavioural consequence sheet for a primary school. Again, using reminder, warning, consequence, potentially working in another class or going to a phase leader. So there's a 5-step approach there, really trying to keep the learning environment sacrosanct. So most schools have expectations about lesson routines, but actually this is a really good way of building in behavioural expectations into the culture of the school. So in effective secondary schools, primary schools, the lesson routines include how children enter and exit from classrooms. In a lot of primary schools, there's a use of non-verbal signals, songs and chants to get attention. Getting that consistent between classes is really pretty important. And, you know, I have 5 children, they've all gone through primary school. And what I was struck by was the different systems used by different teachers in different classrooms in the same primary school. So they just get used to one particular system or one standard, and then there's another standard in a different classroom. These are good schools as well. But I do think that there is an importance in children not having to think too much about their environment and how to behave, because it's just something they're very used to, because it's what you do in that school. And I don't think it would have taken much for the teachers to adopt a common practice, because they weren't that different. And certainly that's what we've been working on in our schools, in our primary schools, making sure that there is consistency between classrooms, there is consistency between phases. So even if there is a different expectation level from the reception through to year 6, there are still the same types of languages being used, the same words are being used. So there's an understanding, children get a very clear understanding where they are on any behavioural pathway. But the important point about any of this is that we ensure that lessons are calm, that they run well, and everybody is able to teach well, because fundamentally that becomes a positive cycle, doesn't it? We all know that consistently good teaching reinforces positive behavior. So if you've got a whole school system which ensures that children arrive at the class in the right frame of mind, then it's up to the teacher to teach well and to reinforce those, so that there's even more positive behavior as they leave the classroom and they go to the next one. And so often, you know, less so in primary where there's less movement, but so often in secondary, there is a transference of poor behavior from one classroom to the next classroom. So this is an example of how we teach in secondary. And again, it's, you know, very clear, pupils line up in silence outside the class, and building in politeness. Ensure the first pupil holds the door open for others. Greet every pupil by name in a positive manner. So, you know, that could even be scripted in some schools. But it is that intention of ritualizing routinely the expectation that we are positive to each other in the school. We are a school that upholds high expectations, expects calm classrooms, expects children to behave well and to learn, but we are polite and warm, and we have relationships built on top of that, which are very positive. And this is an example of lesson routines in a primary school. It's called the Red Roof Way. Red Roof is a primary school, and one of our primary schools actually, and it just explains very, very simply for children how they operate in the classrooms, that they follow structures and routines, they are ready, they actively engage in learning, and they express that they are ready to learn through their body language. In secondary schools, they often use slangs and sort of acronyms like that to ensure that children are paying attention, and they are prepared for what's next. So there's a sort of openness to the way in which they're doing things. And simple, effective routines. Let's move to stakeholder communication. Now, if you are moving the dial on behavior, then obviously communication needs to be much more pervasive and needs to be through all stakeholder groups, governors, senior leadership. Probably that's where it starts. Consultation with staff, consultation with parents, consultation with children, and then roll out and saying how that role is going to work. Taking examples, putting them on X and Twitter, making sure the social media reflects what you're seeing in the classrooms and your successes. That's really important. So it's important to lay out why you're doing it, laying out the school you want to be, and then even if it's not working 100% after 5 months, you've got the examples where it is being promoted to everybody. The communication, as I said, should always emphasize the logic and the staff interaction, the actual living out of the policy on a day-to-day basis, going back to Michael Beer's position, that actually it's all about the experience on a day-to-day basis, which changes culture. Attending to that, making sure the detail of that is being delivered, will over time change the culture. So again, some pause for reflection. Does your school have simple aligned protocols and policies along the lines of those discussed? I'm particularly interested in about the alignment and whether they fit together, whether they speak the same language, whether they deliver the same messages in the staff handbook or staff code, as well as in the behaviour pathways, as well as in prospectuses, as well as any communications on social media. If not, what needs revising? What might you be able to share with others? What might you be able to share in your local networks, in your boroughs or trusts? And are there any points of interest you'd like to see or comment on the examples presented? So, common difficulties. Well, we can go back to common difficulties, and if you do experience things, they could well be to do with poor system design in the first place, those unintended consequences, compromised communication and training. So people not getting the message, not getting it early enough. Communication is very difficult in some schools. It's almost impossible to get it right all the time, and you have to use all the different methods you have available. I think one of the key things is lack of belief in the approach from school leaders, or lack of belief from wider school staff body. If that is the case, then you're likely to have the next point, which is non-compliant staff, either initially or over a period of time. I have to say, it's not for everybody. A strict, warm, strict school with strong behavioural systems, with warm classrooms, with great learning environments, I would think was a no-brainer. But it's not for everybody. Some people like much more individualization in the way in which they run their classrooms, and if that's the case, they've probably got to accept there's going to be much more variability and potential disharmony in terms of achieving the behavioural outcomes they want. Non-compliant pupils, either initially or over time, not always the same ones, interestingly. Usually we get a good couple of weeks in any initiative, and then things start to be pushed, boundaries start to be pushed. And comfortable data is a good one. because you know, we're all beholden to the local authority and to the our governors or trustees. And so if, for example, there is a rise in suspensions because you're tightening things up, that can be difficult because people are saying, well, there's supposed to be better behavior, but look at your suspension rates or look at your detention rates. So it comes back to that later. And that can lead to stakeholder pushback and challenge. And this is where the strength and resilience of the leaders is very important. And actually, the strongest leaders are able to reflect, adjust, but stay the course, and hold the line where it needs to be held. The challenge of expectations for individual pupils and circumstances, like I said right at the beginning, you know, making adjustments for individual pupils and circumstances is important, but it must not undermine the effectiveness of the policy. So, going through some of those, it's really important. If you've got poor system design, you adjust, you don't abandon. One of the problems around any educational policy development is sometimes people will say, oh, this isn't working, and their solution to it not working is, oh, we'll just abandon it. And that's not what should happen. There should be some adjustment. There should be certainty over time, so you can make adjustments, but don't abandon the premise that common approaches, common systems, well thought through rules, routines, and expectations make the difference, because they do. And if you abandon that approach, then there will be a real problem. And I do see people going for some softer approaches, softer in inverted commas, maybe easier approaches, much more around individualization in relationships. The problem with that is that it relies too much on individuals and relationships with individuals, and we cannot expect all children and all adults to have positive relationships with each other without a very clear set of boundaries and framework to do that. So it's the framework, the boundaries, the routines, and the rituals which come first, and then you build those other things on top of that. Or you build them together. In fact, that's probably the best way of doing it. More tricky, perhaps, but certainly that expectation, the bottom line, needs to be there. If there's poor comms or training, it needs to be revisited and improve. If people don't believe it, they need to go and see some other schools. So get people to go and visit other schools that you know of, or find out where schools who've got great practice are, and then go and visit. Most schools who've got great practice are more than happy to support other schools coming in to see things. Non-compliant staff, then it's you know, common collective feedback, but escalation, as I've explained already. Non-compliant pupils, expected, but it will improve. Uncomfortable data, expect it, it will improve. Stakeholder challenge, expect it, it will improve. So holding firm on those things is really pretty critical. The challenge of exceptional individuals or circumstances, we need to support to meet expectations, but special case arrangements can be made, and if they're explainable, justifiable, or they could be managed in a sensible way. So progress is never linear. This is one of the problems in education, and you know, a lot of governors, a lot of stakeholders expect that. So there needs to be depth management and resilience, particularly over the first 18 months and beyond, to sustain improvement, because you will see that data will go one way, they'll go another way. You'll have bad weeks, you'll have good weeks, you'll have bad half terms. But periodic reviews are required to assess the success of the new systems. And it's very unlikely that all indicators will show improvement at the first 24 months. So you've got to expect as a school leader to face significant challenge. And you need to understand that you need some support from key people, but hold true to the principles, because in the end, they will ensure, that's what will ensure the success in the long run. Long-term success, just check the protected characteristics, check your data, check the disproportionality, and then make adjustments if possible, because that will potentially generate concerns. There are likely to be peaks and troughs in this type of data over the long term. So, I've still, in many of the schools we've turned around, our detention rates are much higher than they were before. Why is that? Well, I know why that is, because our expectations are much higher. So the data may not change if your expectations are high. It may always be higher than what you inherit. It can create problems, but you should anticipate it. And I've got a little trend line which I'd like to show you, which is it's not real data, but it's an impressionistic timeline of the types of experiences I've had as a school leader when we've worked in a school. So taking over a school with very difficult behaviours, we would have typically large numbers of suspensions and detentions. And in the first half term, we saw significant reductions. If you look at the graph, the first half term shows that. Then there was about halfway through half term two, you probably see this as well. You expect, I would expect now, you may not expect, but will happen at some point in the first couple of terms, there will be a spike again as children start pushing against the boundaries, and potentially parents as well. And where staff might get a little bit tired, or maybe not following the process as you expect, then there could be a real drive forward from that point. And everybody thinks at the end of that academic year that, oh, these things, it's much, much better. And then you get a little bit of a relapse and things get worse again. And that explains sort of half term 8, that point where you got a second peak, and then you work back down again. It could be, it looks a bit like a COVID graph, doesn't it? But essentially, you will see peaks and troughs. But my experience over time is those peaks and troughs are lower in amplitude as you go forward. So there aren't the big swings that you've seen before, but they may settle at a higher rate, as I've said before, than you were previously, because if your expectations are higher and you're expecting children to come to you and to settle into a new way of working, that takes time for all new children, all reception children, all children entering a PRU, all children entering a secondary school. If you're setting these expectations higher than they've had before, they're going to have difficulty achieving those. And often you have cohort difficulty, staff turnover, which makes things which are beyond your control. And therefore, you're not able to drive things down as effectively as you would like them to be. So the other thing to remember is once you start getting some improvement, expectations shift. And so what was terrible behavior in one of our schools in 2017, that might have been bringing a hammer into school, now might be swearing at a teacher. And still unacceptable, totally unacceptable. But those two levels of the most challenging behavior we're facing have changed. And so you can see an improvement over time in that behavior, but it's not necessarily how staff relay that back to you. So staff surveys need to be thought through very carefully in terms of how you're putting those out there to see if you're trying to ascertain whether staff are experiencing less or more problems. You have to understand a little bit about how you ask the question, because if you ask the question, do you feel the behavior is better or worse, you may not get the right answer. If you ask the question, have you experienced personal verbal abuse in the last 6 months, that might be a better question. It's more specific, and people will tell you exactly what it is, not whether they think notionally behavior is better, because their experience will have changed and their expectations will be raised. So, staff experience significantly improves, but then sometimes it becomes more challenging as they children and families become less compliant, when they start pushing the boundaries. So that is when also leadership is very important in terms of getting people around, getting people back onto the things which are going to make a difference, and ensuring that they follow through. So I would say over time, the thing I've noticed most about improved behavior in schools is that when we do that, typically we get improvements in attainment. And again, these are not subject to peaks and troughs, but they're not uniformly linear. But over time, every place we've taken over where the school has been in difficulty, the attainment over time has improved when we've been able to deal with the behavior, improve the behavior of the children in the classrooms. So, summary. Routines and rituals can shift culture. They will shift culture, actually. I was going as far as to say that. With careful thought, they can be designed to systemize positive behavior and systemize out poor behavior. There are many examples of good practice that can be drawn upon, but these need to be adapted to context. Leaders need to be aware at the outset the difficulties in delivering long-term success, which is a lot of grind, really, a lot of talking to staff, a lot of holding the line, a lot of the difficult parts of the job that we know are around school leadership. And leaders need to be equipped with the belief, knowledge, and determination to succeed, largely because of what I've just said. If you don't have the belief and the knowledge and the determination, then a lot of those difficulties might overwhelm you. And actually, in the past, if you're in a school where you've inherited particular behavioral standards, it may well be that it has overwhelmed previous leaders in the same position as you. So for further guidance, we've got more practical guidance on implementation, and examples of excellent practice can be accessed through the Behaviour Hubs program. And these videos on leadership and management, attendance, punctuality, SEND, and data and accountability. So that is the end of the video. I just want to thank you for listening. I hope it has made sense. And if it hasn't, I hope that it doesn't put you off and you look for resources which will be able to assist you in your journey forward in terms of improving behaviour in your school, because there are so many benefits that come from that for the children's well-being, staff well-being, and fundamentally the outcomes that we want all of our children to achieve. Thank you for listening.